The moment the front door of Ristorante Cuore Nero opened that Thursday evening, Elena Marsh stopped breathing for the length of time it takes a person to understand something they were not expecting to understand. She was standing near the back wall of the dining room, close to the gap between the service counter and the kitchen door, holding a tray with 3 full glasses of water for the table near the window. Her grip went so tight and so suddenly still that the water surfaces did not ripple. The stillness was not a decision. Her body made it before her mind caught up, the way bodies do when they recognize something they have been trained by experience to recognize as dangerous. Her whole system went quiet. She stood in the shadow between the counter and the kitchen door, and she watched the man cross the threshold and pause just inside the entrance, letting his eyes move across the room the way a person moves their eyes across a room they are entering for the first time, or a room they are entering again after having been away. She knew that face. She had known it for 14 years, since she was 17 years old and standing barefoot in the front hallway of her family's home on a November evening, while outside, through the window, 2 men she did not recognize were walking her father out to the back seat of a gray car. Her father had not fought. He had not struggled or argued or called out. He had walked with the 2 men in the particular way of a person who has been carrying the knowledge of this moment for a long time and has nothing left by the time it arrives. Elena had pressed her hand flat against the cold glass of the window and watched the car move away from the gate, and she had stood there until she could no longer see the rear lights. The 3rd man had stayed at the gate. He had kept his back partly turned to the house, watching the street while the other 2 worked, standing with his arms loose at his sides and his collar turned up against the November wind. A charcoal coat, wide collar, dark hair, a face that was arranged in the practiced blankness of a man accustomed to being present at moments he did not want to be identified with. She had looked at that face through the window. She had looked at it for a long time without being able to stop. She was 31 now. It had been 14 years. His hair had more gray in it, and his face had the settled quality of a man who had arrived at an age where his features had finished finding their arrangement. But she knew him. She would have known him in any crowd, in any city, in any light, at any age. The face was the kind that pressed itself into the deepest available space in your memory and stayed there permanently, patient and specific, waiting for you to encounter it again. His name was Dante Ricci. He came with 5 men. They took the corner table, the large round one with the red tablecloth and the slightly taller candle in the center, the one that Signor Aldo reserved for parties of 6 or more, because it was the only table in the room with enough space. They settled into it with the unhurried ease of men who were accustomed to entering rooms and finding them arranged to their satisfaction. None of them made noise. None of them looked around the room with any particular attention. They simply occupied the space and let the room reorganize itself around them, which it did, in the quiet adjustments of every other occupied table in the room, the slight dimming of nearby conversations, the shift of eyes to other things. Elena had worked in this restaurant for 12 years, and she had learned to read the temperature of a room the way a sailor learns to read weather. She felt the room change, and she understood the change precisely. Signor Aldo had one rule. He had never stated it directly. He had never needed to. Everyone who came to work for him understood it within 2 weeks of starting, absorbed it through the atmosphere of the place the way you absorb the customs of a household you live in long enough. You did not ask about the tables. You did not listen to conversations that were not directed at you. You brought the food and the wine and the bill, and you carried nothing out of the restaurant that belonged to the restaurant. Not a story, not a name, not a face, not a word you heard that was not meant for you. This was the agreement. It was clear, and it was fair, and it was the thing that had made Ristorante Cuore Nero what it was, a place that existed in the neighborhood as a kind of neutral ground, a room where things could be not said and not noticed, and where the business of the evening was always only the food and the wine. Elena had kept this agreement without a single moment of difficulty for 12 years. Tonight was the end of that 12 years. Owen was working the section that included the corner table. He was 22 years old and 5 months into the job, and he was good at service in the mechanical sense, organized and reliable, and quick to learn the steps of the work. What he did not yet have was the other thing, the thing that could not be taught in 5 months, and was not really teachable in any direct way. The ability to read the difference between a table that wanted to be served and a table that needed to be understood. He started toward the corner with his notepad out, and his professional greeting already forming on his face. Elena set the water tray on the nearest flat surface and caught him by the sleeve before he had taken 4 steps. "I've got the corner tonight," she said. He looked at her. The corner table was in his section. She knew it was in his section. "Full Benedetti trade," she said. "Rest of the week, both shifts, all tips." Owen did the math quickly, the way young men do math when it is about money, and the math was clearly in his favor. He shrugged and handed over his notepad and moved to the other side of the room, already thinking about something else. Elena watched him go. She stood where she was for a moment. She put her hand in her apron pocket and felt the pen that was always there, the ordinary ballpoint she wrote orders with. She pressed both palms flat against her thighs once, feeling the fabric. She adjusted the apron strap across her left shoulder. Then she walked to the corner table and she smiled at 6 men and she asked what she could bring them to start. Dante Ricci did not look at her face. He did not look up from the table when she approached, and he did not look at her when he spoke. He ordered the wine looking at the surface of the tablecloth. He said thank you to the middle distance. He went back to the conversation that had paused only long enough for the order to be placed. Elena wrote the order and carried it to the bar, and stood with her back to the room for a moment. She was aware of the sound of her own breathing. She was aware of the tightness across her shoulders, the locked jaw, the way the room behind her felt both enormous and very close in the way it feels when you are trying not to let it know that you are afraid. She had served thousands of tables in 12 years. She had served difficult people and rude people, and people who made her feel invisible in the contemptuous way of people who have decided that certain other people are beneath their notice. She had learned to move through all of it the way water moves through things, without stopping, continuing along the course. She was good at this. It was one of the things she was best at. But Dante Ricci at the corner table was not a difficult customer. He was the 3rd man at the gate on the night her father did not come back, and every approach to that table made her 17 again, made the room too large, made her feet cold on the tile of the front hallway. She brought the wine, she brought the bread, she took the food orders from each of the 6 men without her hands shaking once, which she noticed the way you notice something that surprises you. She passed the orders to the kitchen. She returned to her station. She watched the table the way she watched all her tables, with the professional attentiveness of a person responsible for another person's experience of an evening, and she listened without trying to listen. This was how she would describe it later, to the journalist, 2 years after the fact, in a cold cafe on a February afternoon. She was not trying to listen. She was simply close, the way good service required closeness, existing at the useful edge of the table's field of attention. She was refilling a water glass 2 tables away when the words came through the ambient sound of the dining room with the specific clarity that certain words have when they land on a mind that is already oriented toward a particular frequency. Via Mazzini. midnight. And then a word in the thick Sicilian dialect that was specific to this neighborhood, the kind of word that had moved through this neighborhood for generations, in the way certain words move through certain places, attached to certain kinds of meaning that everyone who grew up here understood without being taught, the way you understood a weather sign that your grandfather's generation read in the sky. The man on Ricci's left made a small sound of agreement. Ricci's hand came down on the table once, flat, a single quiet gesture that meant the sentence was complete, and the matter was decided. Elena set the water pitcher on the edge of the neighboring table and stood upright and walked to the kitchen. She put a stack of empty plates in the washing area and she turned on the cold tap and she let the water run over her wrists. She stood looking at the drain. Her brother's name was Patrick Marsh. He was 26 years old. He had a late shift at a produce distribution warehouse on Via Mazzini that ran from 9 in the evening until 2 in the morning, every weekday and alternate weekends, handling the intake of shipping containers for 3 grocery chains that supplied the western part of the city. He had been doing this shift for 18 months because it paid a third more than the day shift, and the extra money was covering 2 community college classes on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. He was studying logistics. He wanted to understand the systems that moved goods from one part of the world to another, the mathematics and the organization of it, the elegant complexity of supply chains. He talked about it at Sunday dinners with a careful, contained enthusiasm that he tried to moderate, because enthusiasm had always felt in this family like something that needed to be kept somewhat private, somewhat protected, the way you keep a fire covered in wind. The corner table had just spoken his street and his time. Elena stood over the sink and thought about her brother's face. The way you think about something, when you have only a few minutes to decide whether you are willing to risk it. She did not think about risk in those terms. She did not frame it as risk or not risk. She thought about his face and the Sunday dinners, and the way his voice sounded when he was explaining something that mattered to him, and she thought that all of it, the whole 12 years of holding things together, the rent paid and the dinners made, and the phone calls twice a week, meant nothing if her brother was standing on a corner on Via Mazzini at midnight tomorrow night. She turned off the tap. She dried her hands. She stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the back of Dante Ricci's head for 4 seconds, which she counted deliberately. He was sitting straight in the way of a man who had never had to make himself smaller in any room he had entered. He had a wine glass near his right hand. He was listening to someone with the focused patience of a man for whom listening is an instrument rather than a courtesy. Elena went to the shelf near the host stand, where the printed receipts from the completed tables were stacked. She took one from the middle of the stack, a table from an hour ago, a couple who had eaten pasta and drunk a half bottle of wine and paid their bill and gone home with no awareness that their dinner receipt would be put to any use beyond the filing. She turned it over. The back was blank. She took her pen from her apron pocket and she sat down on the low stool behind the host stand. She sat without writing for a moment, not because she was uncertain. The moment she had turned off the tap in the kitchen, she had moved past uncertainty, or uncertainty had moved past her, the way a wave passes. She sat because she was thinking about the 9 words that were already formed somewhere below the level of conscious thought, and she was thinking about how to put them on the paper in the smallest possible space, with the most possible accuracy, leaving nothing out and adding nothing extra. She wrote in the Sicilian dialect of this neighborhood, the specific dialect her father had spoken at the kitchen table and her grandmother had spoken at the market on Saturday mornings, slightly different from standard Sicilian, in ways that only someone who had grown up in this specific part of the city would recognize or use naturally. 9 words, a street, a time, a person who would be standing there, and in the space that 9 words can open when they are the right 9 words in the right order, a question about what kind of man was reading them. No name, no accusation, no proof, a description of a fact, and an implicit invitation to decide. She folded the receipt in the square, flat way she folded every bill at every table every night of her working life. She slid it under the leather cover of the bill folder, with the practiced ease of a person who has done this motion so many thousands of times that it required no thought whatsoever. She stood up. She adjusted her apron. She walked across the dining room, between the occupied tables, through the familiar geography of 12 years of work, past the chairs she knew by their degree of wobble, and the wall near table 9, where the paint had been scuffed for 2 years without being fixed. She set the bill folder in front of Dante Ricci. She said what she said at the end of every table of every shift she had ever worked, that she hoped the evening had been wonderful, and that they were very welcome back any time. She said it in the same warm, professional voice she always used, the voice 12 years of practice had made into something as reliable as a tool, present and steady in every circumstance. Then she turned and she walked back toward the kitchen. She did not look back. She had thought about this precisely, in the 30 seconds between sitting at the host stand and standing up with the bill folder in her hand. The instinct would be to look back, because looking back was what you did when you had done something and the question of its consequences was living in your chest like a held breath. But a person who had simply said goodnight to a table and moved on did not look back. A person who had only done their job did not turn to check what happened next, so she did not turn. She walked to the kitchen and went to the sink and ran the cold water over her wrists and counted to 60, counting deliberately and without rush, the way she had taught herself to count through fear when she was a child, giving the fear something to organize itself around until it became something she could carry rather than something that was carrying her. She counted to 60. She turned off the water. She dried her hands. Owen appeared in the kitchen doorway with a tray of empty glasses. "Corner table's paying," he said, without any particular interest. "Thank you," Elena said. She waited until she heard the sound of chairs, and then she went back out to the dining room. She went to a table on the far side of the room and began collecting empty plates, and she was aware, in the peripheral way that a person who has worked a room for 12 years becomes aware of things, of 6 men standing and moving toward the door. She kept her hands busy. She stacked the plates in the careful method that prevented breakage. She did not look at the corner. The front door opened. She heard the brief cold air. The door closed. She went to the corner table. The leather bill folder sat where she had left it. She opened it. Inside was the full amount of the bill, exact and correct, and a tip that was 3 times larger than any tip she had received from any table in 12 years at this restaurant. She stood with the cash in her hand and she looked at it. Then she put it back inside the folder and closed it and carried it to Aldo. He counted the tip twice. He looked at her over the top of his reading glasses, with the look of a man who is not asking the question he is thinking about. "Good table?" he said. "Yes," Elena said. He nodded and put the money in the drawer and looked back at his paper. She went back to the floor for the last 40 minutes of the shift, and she worked through them with the same attention she brought to every other 40 minutes of every other shift, because that was what you did. The work did not stop, and she was a waitress. She finished the shift. She said goodnight to Owen and to the kitchen staff and to Aldo. She went to the locker room and she sat on the bench in her coat with her bag on her lap and her phone in her hand, and she sat there for a while looking at the geometric pattern on the tile floor, a simple design in beige and white that she had looked at hundreds of times without ever quite seeing. She called Patrick. He answered on the 3rd ring. There was warehouse noise in the background, the sounds she knew from the time she had picked him up from work, a rumble and a rhythm of things being moved. "You're calling during my shift," he said. "I know. Listen, you're sick tomorrow night." A pause. "I'm not sick. I'm fine. Tomorrow night you're sick. You call in, and you stay home. I can't lose the pay, Lena. I've got the semester fees due next month and—" She said his name in the voice. Just his name. In the voice their mother had used exactly twice in Elena's childhood for things that were not discussions. Their mother had been a small woman who had raised 2 children alone after the gray car took her husband, and who had not, in all the years Elena could remember, ever shown fear to either of them. Not once, not visibly. She had arranged herself in front of her children between the fear and them, and she had faced it from that position without letting them see what it cost her. Elena had studied that voice for 20 years, and now it was hers. "Do you understand what I'm telling you?" she said. The warehouse sounds continued. She heard him breathing. She held the silence. She did not fill it. "Is something wrong?" he asked, quietly now. "No," she said, "but you're staying home tomorrow night. That's final." A long pause. Then, in the voice of a man who does not have the full picture but understands that the full picture is not available to him right now, he said, "Okay. Good. Sunday I'll make the pasta." "Okay," he said. She ended the call. She sat on the bench for 2 more minutes and then she stood up and went home. The next morning arrived in the standard Palermo November way, gray sky and damp cold air with the smell of stone and diesel and the distant sea mixed into it, and Elena was at the restaurant by 7. She moved through the opening routine that 12 years had made automatic: salt cellars, menus, cutlery, reservations, candles. The corner table with the red tablecloth, the slightly taller candle in the center, straightened until it stood perfectly vertical. While she worked, she thought about the receipt, not with fear, or not primarily fear. Fear was there, but it had settled into the background the way it settles when a decision has been made and there is nothing left to decide about. The receipt was already in the world. The decision had been made. You did not undo these things by being afraid of them afterward. Aldo arrived at 7:30 with his newspaper and his espresso from the bar across the street. He stood at the host stand in the way he always stood there in the mornings, reading the front page with the coffee held loosely in his right hand, not drinking it urgently, in the way of a man for whom the morning coffee was a ritual and not a need. Without looking up from the page, he asked whether the large table last night had caused her any trouble. She said no. He turned a page. She went to the kitchen to begin the lunch prep. 40 kilometers outside the city, behind a line of cypress trees on a farm property that sat at the end of a long gravel drive, a man known in the neighborhood as Gallo was at his breakfast table when his phone rang before 8 in the morning. Early calls had a specific meaning in his world, and he understood that meaning before he answered. He listened for less than a minute. He said yes twice. He ended the call and set his phone face down on the table and looked at his breakfast without eating it. His wife asked if the eggs had gone cold. He said they had. She got up to make more. He sat with both hands flat on the cloth, and he said nothing else, and when the new plate came, he ate without tasting, and excused himself and went to the back room that was always kept locked, and made several phone calls over the next 2 hours. Each call was short, Each produced the result of a short conversation between men who understand each other without needing to use many words. By noon, 4 arrangements that had existed for the following night had been quietly dissolved. No explanation was given to the men affected by this. None was expected or asked for. The arrangements simply no longer existed, replaced by other things that needed doing. And the men involved understood this as the total and final statement of the situation. That evening, Via Mazzini at midnight held only the ordinary contents of a Palermo night. A parked car with a cracked rear taillight, a stray cat on the hood of it, watching the street with the unmoved patience of a creature that had survived many nights in this neighborhood and expected to survive many more. The yellow circle of light from the street lamp made its usual circle on the dark, wet cobblestones. Patrick Marsh was at home. He had called in sick to the warehouse and his supervisor had been unsympathetic, and he was going to lose a night's pay, and he could not understand why his sister had insisted with that voice of hers, the one that sounded so much like their mother, that arguing with it felt like arguing with the air. He had spent the evening watching a football match he had no particular interest in, and eating overcooked pasta he had made himself, and feeling moderately irritated about all of it. He called Elena at 11 to lodge his complaint. She answered on the second ring. "I am completely fine," he said. "I feel absolutely fine. I have felt fine all day and all evening. I would have been perfectly capable of working." "Good," Elena said. "I lost a full night's pay. Come Sunday. I'll make it up to you." "You don't have to make it up to me. I want to understand why you made me do this." "Sunday," she said. "I'll make the pasta." A pause. She could hear him deciding whether to push, and then deciding not to. He had always known, even when he was small, that certain things about his sister were not available to be pushed. "Okay," he said. "Good," she said. "Drive carefully." "I'm at home," he said. "I'm not driving anywhere." "Good," she said again, and ended the call. She stood in her kitchen with the phone in her hand for a long moment. Then she set it down on the counter and finished washing the dishes from her own dinner, which had been modest and eaten late, and she dried each plate carefully and put it away and went to bed. She slept without difficulty. In the morning she called Patrick before he was properly awake, and he answered sounding confused, and she said good morning and asked how he was. He said he was fine, and slightly confused about why she was calling before 7. She said she was glad he was fine and she would see him Sunday. There was a pause. "Lena," he said, using the name he had called her since he was 2 years old. "Sunday," she said. "Get some more sleep." She ended the call and set the phone down and stood in the kitchen looking out the window at the gray morning city. She did not know about the calls Gallo had made. She did not know about the 4 dissolving arrangements or the empty corner at midnight. She would not know any of that specifically for 2 more years, when she would sit across from a journalist in a cold cafe, and the journalist would eventually trace the shape of it through records and sources that Elena herself had no access to. She knew only what she had made happen, and that she had made happen something, because the tip on the corner table had been 3 times the bill, and that was a statement, and she had read it as a statement, and the statement said the matter was received, and the subject was closed. She made her coffee. She got dressed for work. She served her shifts. She carried the trays. She went home on Sunday and made the pasta correctly, and Patrick arrived and ate 2 large plates of it, and drank most of the wine she had bought, and complained cheerfully about his Tuesday reading assignment, and talked for an hour about a lecture he had attended on container shipping systems and the way port logistics functioned at scale. He talked about it with the careful, contained excitement she loved in him, the enthusiasm he tried to keep to a moderate volume and could not entirely manage. She listened to every word. She watched his face across the table, her brother, 26, and full of plans, and she felt something move through her that had no accurate name in the available vocabulary. It was too large for relief, and too quiet for joy, and too specific for gratitude, though it contained all 3. It was the feeling of a thing that had almost gone wrong, and had not gone wrong, and the distance between those 2 outcomes was visible to only one person in the room. She did not tell him. She passed the wine and asked about the lecture and listened to him explain, and outside the kitchen window the city made its ordinary Sunday evening sounds, and the candles burned down evenly on the table, and the pasta was gone, and the wine was nearly gone, and her brother was alive and at her table, and that was the whole of what she needed the world to contain. The weeks after that November evening had a texture that Elena would struggle to find words for in the years afterward when she tried to describe them. On the surface, they were completely ordinary. She opened the restaurant on her opening mornings. She served her shifts. She cleared her tables and checked her station and said goodnight to Aldo, who continued not asking questions. She called Patrick twice a week and went to the market on Saturdays and to church on Sunday evenings. These were the rhythms of her life, and she moved through them with the steady, practiced presence of a person who is very good at appearing normal, because appearing normal has always been, for her, a survival skill rather than a performance. Below the surface, the texture was different. She was carrying something that had no adequate name in the categories available to her. It was not fear, though fear had been the beginning of it, and was still present in the way a scar is present, as a changed texture in the tissue, felt when you press it. It was not relief either, or not only relief. Relief was too clean and too complete a word for what she felt. It was more like the feeling of a rope that has been under very high tension and is now under slightly less tension, still taut, still bearing load, but with one thread of the extreme stress removed from it. You could feel the difference. The feeling was real, but the rope was still the rope. She slept reasonably well. She worked carefully. She did not talk about it. 3 weeks after the night of the receipt, on a Thursday evening in early December, Dante Ricci came back to the restaurant. Elena was refilling the bread basket behind the service counter when she heard the front door and felt, before she turned, the familiar adjustment of the room. She turned slowly. She saw him at the entrance with his 5 men. She set the bread basket down on the nearest surface, and she went to find Owen. "Corner table," she said. "Mine." Owen looked at her. He had stopped asking why. She had made good on the Benedetti trade, and he had come to the simple working conclusion that she preferred large tables and the corner section, and left it at that. He stepped aside. She took the menus to the corner. She stood in her position at the edge of the table's useful attention, and she smiled, and she asked what she could bring them to start. Dante Ricci looked at his menu, not at her face. He ordered the wine, a specific bottle from the western part of the island, that she wrote down correctly and brought without comment. He said please in the way a man says please who is accustomed to being obeyed with or without it. The conversation at the table had paused for the order, and it resumed when she stepped away, and she served the table through the whole of the evening with complete professional attention, the kind of attention that was not about anything except service, that had no other layer visible in it. At the end of the evening, she brought the bill in the leather folder and set it on the table, and said what she always said. He paid exactly. The right amount and a reasonable tip, the kind that any satisfied large table might leave. Nothing pointed in it. No message embedded in the number. She cleared the table and took the bill folder to Aldo, and Aldo counted it and made no particular comment, and she went back to the floor. That was the end of it. That was all there was. A table that came and was served and paid and left. A round of service completed in the ordinary way of all the thousands of rounds of service she had completed over 12 years. The table came back 2 weeks after that, and 3 weeks after that, and through the winter and into the spring it became a semi-regular presence in the restaurant, appearing every few weeks in the evening, with the same 6 men, and the same quiet occupation of the corner, and the same ordinary transaction at the end of each visit. Elena served them every time. She took the table from Owen with a simple statement, and Owen, who had by now filed this under Elena's known preferences, simply stepped aside. The tips were always reasonable, correct, appropriate, the kind that communicated the satisfaction of a customer who had received what they came for, and had nothing additional to say about it. There was never anything pointed in the amounts, never anything that could be read as a signal or a message. This, she understood, was itself the message, the most legible possible kind. The subject was closed, the account was settled, the matter had been received and processed and disposed of, and they existed now only as waitress and customer inside the ordinary transaction of a restaurant, and the whole of what had passed between them on a November evening through a leather folder on a round table with a red cloth was finished. Finished for him, finished for her, equally and completely finished for both. She received this message clearly. It was not safety. She had stopped believing in safety as an absolute condition when she was 17 years old, standing in her hallway on cold tile, watching a gray car take her father away, understanding in that moment that no arrangement of circumstances held permanently, that the floor under any life was the floor until it was not, and then you managed from there. What she had instead of safety was something more conditional and more honest, a provisional arrangement with the world, a floor that was holding for now, and for now was what anyone ever had. The only thing worth doing with for now was to live on it. She served the tables, she carried the trays, she brought the bills in leather folders, and said at the end of every evening that she hoped everything had been wonderful. She went home on Sundays and made the pasta, and listened to her brother. She did not tell anyone, not Owen, not Aldo, not the woman from her church who had known her for 20 years, not any colleague or neighbor or friend. The 9 words in dialect were hers. They would remain hers. Some things you hold because they must be held and there is no one else to hold them, and you hold them in the place where they can do no harm to anyone, which is in the back of your own deepest available space. She held them there. Katerina Bruswick was 44 years old when she began the project. She was a journalist who had spent 2 decades covering organized crime in Sicily, and she had grown tired, in the final years of that career, of covering the structures of it. The organizational hierarchies and the arrests and the court proceedings and the endlessly elaborated map of who answered to whom. She was more interested in what happened to the ordinary people who lived around it, not in it, and not fighting it, but simply near it. The way you are near a river when you live in a town that has a river running through it. It is there. It has always been there. You learn the currents and the shallow places, and you find your crossings, and you live with it the way you live with a permanent feature of the landscape that predates you and will outlast you, without making the living with it visible, because making it visible accomplishes nothing except making you visible. She had been collecting these stories for 4 years. She had interviewed more than 30 people. She found them through the patient, indirect work of journalism, through neighbors and former colleagues, and the careful tracing of connections through a neighborhood across time. And each time she found one, she sat with them in a public place and asked them to tell her what had happened, and she listened without interrupting for as long as it took. The name Elena Marsh came to her through a woman named Rosa, who had grown up on the same street, and who mentioned Elena in a conversation that had nothing to do with the project, in the offhand way that people mention someone when they have been thinking about them. Rosa mentioned her with a quality in her voice that Katerina had learned, over 4 years of this kind of listening, to pay attention to. Not admiration exactly, though there was admiration in it. Something quieter. The respect you feel for someone who has done something important in conditions of complete silence, without recognition, without being able to tell anyone that they did it. Katerina found the restaurant. She called ahead. She introduced herself and the project clearly and honestly, explained what she was writing and what she hoped to do with it, said she was looking for the stories of ordinary people who had made difficult decisions in situations they had not chosen, and had carried those decisions alone for years afterward. Elena said she would think about it and let Katerina know. Katerina thanked her and meant the thanks. She moved on to other interviews. 2 weeks later her phone rang, and it was Elena saying she had thought about it and yes, she would talk, if Katerina was still interested. They met at a small cafe on a February Tuesday, 3 streets from the restaurant, the city outside gray and cold in the way Palermo was gray and cold in February, full and busy, and going about its business. Elena arrived precisely on time in her work clothes, because she had a dinner shift at 5. She ordered a coffee, and she held the cup in both hands, and she looked at Katerina across the small table with the clear, measuring gaze of a woman who has spent 12 years deciding quickly and accurately whether a stranger can be trusted. She must have found the answer she was looking for, because she began to talk. She talked for 3 hours. She did not begin at the beginning. She began in the middle, in the specific second when the door opened and she felt the room change, and she moved outward from there in both directions, backward to her father and the gray car and the face she had kept in her memory for 14 years, forward through the receipt and the pen and the 9 words and the leather folder and the walk back to the kitchen without turning around. She described the money in the folder afterward. She described calling her brother from the locker room. She described the weeks that followed, the return visits, the ordinary tips that told her the matter was concluded. Katerina's hand cramped twice. At one point she set her pen down entirely and just listened, and Elena continued without appearing to notice the difference, her voice steady and even, and without drama, the voice of a person who has held a thing for a long time and knows exactly the shape of it. When Elena finished, the cafe had emptied around them. The afternoon had gone dark. Both coffee cups had been cold for the better part of an hour. Katerina said quietly that she needed a moment. Elena waited. She was practiced at waiting. "What made you do it?" Katerina asked. She had asked this question of 30 people in 4 years. She asked it at the right moment, when the story was fully told, and the teller was still inside it. "You could have kept walking." You could have heard those words and decided you had not heard them. Nobody would have known. Elena was quiet. She looked out the window. A woman was pulling a cart of groceries up the slight incline of the pavement, leaning forward into the weight of it, her coat too thin for the temperature. "I thought about my brother's face," Elena said, "and how much time I had left before the bill was due." Katerina wrote that down carefully, making sure she had every word exactly right. And when she looked up, Elena was already pulling on her coat. Dinner shift at 5. Elena thanked her for listening, which Katerina found exactly the wrong way around, and she buttoned her coat and walked out into the gray February afternoon. Katerina sat at the small table alone for a while. She had material to organize and notes to review, and 3 other interviews to schedule for the following week, but she sat without doing any of those things for a while, because some stories require a moment before you can put them in the drawer with the other stories, and this was one of them. She did not use Elena's last name in the book. Elena had asked to appear only as Elena, a waitress in Palermo, and Katerina honored this exactly, because the whole point of the thing, the entire gravity of it, lay in the fact that it could have been any waitress in Palermo, and was therefore, in the terms of a book, none of them specifically. In the terms of real life, it was one woman and one November evening and 9 words in a particular dialect, but the book needed to hold the story lightly enough that Elena could walk past it on any shelf without being visible, and so it did. The book was published in the spring of 2016, and Katerina sent a copy to the restaurant in a padded envelope addressed to Elena in care of Ristorante Cuore Nero, which was the only address she had for her. Aldo set it on the counter without comment, as he set all mail on the counter without comment, because he was 65 years old and had been not commenting on things for most of his adult life. Elena took the envelope home that evening. She opened it at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and she read her chapter 3 times. The first time fast, to understand what was there. The second time slowly, attending to each sentence, to the choices Katerina had made about what to include and what to leave out, to the way the silences had been handled. The third time she sat with the book open to the chapter and looked at the page without reading, thinking about the Tuesday afternoon and the 2 cold cups of coffee and Katerina's cramped hand. The account was accurate, careful in a way Elena had not expected and was grateful for. The silences were intact. Nothing had been filled in with interpretation. The story was the story, neither more nor less than what she had told, and she found that reading it was like hearing herself speak in a room with very good acoustics, clear and complete and entirely recognizable as her own. She wrote Katerina a short letter of thanks and sent it to the publisher's address on the copyright page. She never knew if it arrived. She found, after a while, that this did not matter much to her. The letter was sent. That was what she had meant to do. She put the book on the shelf in her bedroom between 2 other books she had read and kept, and she went to sleep. Dante Ricci died on the 14th of March in 2014, at the age of 57. The cause was cardiac. There was a brief notice in the back pages of 2 Palermo newspapers. One mentioned a period of interest from law enforcement in a subordinate clause. The other mentioned nothing beyond the fact of the death. Elena heard about it from her neighbor Gianna in the stairwell of their building on a Thursday morning, passing in opposite directions. Gianna was 60 years old and had lived in this building for 30 of them, and she kept current with certain kinds of news because she had been in this neighborhood long enough to understand that keeping current was a form of situational awareness rather than morbid interest. She mentioned it the way she mentioned things, as information being passed along without editorial comment, and Elena said she was sorry to hear it, because that was what you said, and Gianna nodded and continued down the stairs. Elena went into her apartment and stood in the kitchen for a while. Not with any particular thought, not processing it in any organized way, simply standing in the kitchen with the ordinary morning light coming through the window and the ordinary sounds of the building around her, other apartments beginning their days, water running through pipes, someone's radio coming on briefly and then going quiet. She stood there the way you stand when something large has shifted and you are waiting for your body to finish registering the shift before deciding what comes next. He was gone. Whatever he had thought about a November evening in a restaurant, Whatever he had felt or decided or carried forward from that corner table into the years of his life, he had kept it as completely as she had kept her end of it. This was something she had not quite articulated to herself before, and she thought about it now, standing in the kitchen, with the morning light coming in. The symmetry of it. They had each held their portion of something unspoken, without ever acknowledging to each other that there was something being held, and now he had let go of his portion, and she held the whole of it. But she was practiced. She had been practicing since she was 17 years old, standing barefoot on cold tile. The receipt was gone with him. He had taken it from the restaurant that night, and whatever he had done with it afterward, destroyed it, or kept it somewhere, or simply left it in a coat pocket until the coat was given away, was gone now too. The receipt existed in one place only, in the memory of Elena Marsh, in the deepest available space in her mind, where it had settled on the night she wrote it. She made coffee. She called Patrick. He answered in the middle of a sentence he was finishing about something else, cheerful, occupied with his own day. She listened to him finish the sentence. She asked about the week. He asked about hers. He asked if she was all right, and she said yes. She was just a bit tired. Long week at the restaurant. "Come Sunday?" he asked. "I'll make the pasta," she said. "I'll bring the wine," he said. She said good night, though it was morning, and he laughed at the mistake, which was unusual for her, and she smiled at the mistake too, and said she meant good morning, and they said goodbye. She finished making the coffee and drank it at the kitchen table, looking out the window, and then she got dressed and went to work. Elena Marsh was 42 years old in the year the book was published. She had been at Ristorante Cuore Nero for 23 years. She was the senior member of the serving staff. She held the spare keys to the front door and the wine cabinet. She trained new hires. She still opened the restaurant on her mornings, arriving at 7, moving through the routine that 2 decades had made completely automatic. Salt cellars, menus, cutlery. The corner table with the red tablecloth and the slightly taller candle in the center, straightened until it stood perfectly upright. She still said at the end of every table of every evening that she hoped everything had been wonderful and that they were very welcome back any time. She still meant it on most evenings, not all of them, but most. Patrick was 34. He had finished his degree and was working as a distribution coordinator for a regional shipping company, managing the scheduling of 3 delivery routes across the western part of the island. He was good at the work in the way that people are good at work they were always going to find their way toward. He came for Sunday dinners less frequently than before, because his life had more in it now. A partner, and an apartment across the city, and a schedule that did not always align with hers. But often enough that she still made the pasta correctly when he came, and still set the table for 2 and still listened to him talk with the same attention she had given his voice since he was small. She had never told him. She had thought about it over the years in the way you think about things you have already decided not to do. She had imagined the conversation, what it would hold, what she would have to watch move through his face. She had decided that there was nothing he could do with the knowledge that would serve him. He had his life. It was full and it was moving, and it was going in the direction he had always wanted to go. The Sunday dinners were enough. The twice-weekly calls were enough. Listening to him talk about logistics with the careful enthusiasm he had never entirely learned to contain was enough. More than enough. You held what needed holding. You held it where it could do no harm. That was the entirety of the principle, as simple to state as it was demanding to live by, and she had lived by it for 23 years. On the last Sunday of October, in the year the book came out, she made the pasta correctly, and Patrick arrived with a good bottle of wine and a long story about a scheduling crisis that had required him to redesign an entire distribution route in 48 hours, without losing a single delivery. He explained the problem, and then he explained the solution, and then he explained how the solution and the problem had arrived at each other through a process he described with the compact precision of a person who has done the work and understands it from the inside. His voice had the qualities she had always loved in it, the careful, contained excitement of a person describing something they are genuinely proud of without wanting to make too much of the pride. She listened through the pasta and through the wine and through the fruit in the bowl she had put out for after dinner. And when he was done, she said it sounded like he had handled it very well. He said he thought he had. He said it with the quiet confidence of a person who knows a thing is true and does not particularly need the confirmation. And Elena looked at him across the table and felt the feeling she had no accurate name for, the one that was too large for any single word from the vocabulary of ordinary emotional experience. She felt it move through her the way weather moves through a landscape, taking everything in at once without stopping anywhere. She poured them both more wine. She asked how the new route was going. He told her. Outside, the city made its ordinary autumn sounds. The candles burned in the kitchen with the steady, even quality of candles that are not in a draft. The wine was good. The pasta had been made correctly, the way their mother had shown her when she was 12 years old, standing in a smaller kitchen, in a house that no longer belonged to either of them, with her mother's hand over hers on the handle of the pan, showing her the exact moment the sauce needed to come off the heat. The bill had been due. She had paid it. Everything had been wonderful. They were very welcome back any time.